Good evening, and great pleasure to have you here. So sorry for being 10 minutes late, but we decided that rain probably is going to stop some people come on time. So this is the third talk of our big geopolitical talk series that we started with the Austrian Ministry of Defense. And this is real pleasure for me to introduce to you for this discussion probably one of the most accomplished diplomats in the world today. It's true. It's true. Ambassador Menon has an absolutely extraordinary career. So he was Indian ambassador to China. Before it, he was working in the embassy in China during the Cultural Revolution. He was an Indian ambassador to Israel. He was a foreign secretary, which was the most senior diplomat in the Indian foreign ministry. He was the national security advisor to the former Indian Prime Minister. But also, like the people that we basically very much wanted to invite for this series, it's not about the positions that they have taken, because these positions are always occupied. Yeah. But also, he was very much trying to conceptualize what is happening in the world. His latest book, Choices, Inside the Making of the Indian Foreign Policy, was there, and he's waiting for the new book to be published till the end of the year. So from this point of view, for us was very important to do the following. We know that the world is changing, and we're repeating it all the time. But we always believe that we see the change of the world similarly because we repeat it, but the change of the world looks very different. Depends on your perspective, your place, to be honest, your experience also, the size of the country, the type of the history you're coming from. And from this point of view, Europeans, we have been very much kind of stuck in our own perspective of what is changing, not changing. We like to talk about crisis, but in the 1970s, they used to know that in order to understand the crisis, it's very important to know whose crisis it is. And from this point of view, I want basically to give the ambassador 35, 40 minutes to present his views of how he sees this changing world. Then, basically, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions, and then we're really going for a conversation. So I do believe you're going to enjoy this. So,
thank you. Yeah. Stand up here.
Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for that very flattering introduction. As you can see, he's a friend. He's very biased, so you don't have to listen to everything he says. But it's really an honor to be here at IWM, and it's good of you to ask me, and especially when I heard that it's part of this grand series of lectures. It was suggested to me that I speak to you about the geopolitics, Asia's new geopolitics, and it probably looks very different from Delhi than it does from Vienna, as you said. But what I thought I'd do is try and describe how it looks to one Indian, and then maybe where it might be heading, and then maybe we could discuss it and we could see. I'd like to hear what you think about it. Because, again, as Ivan said, we live in an amazing, a paradoxical age. There's a good case for optimism. That we've never had a higher proportion of humanity living longer, better, healthier, wealthier lives than today, if you look at the numbers. So theoretically, at least, there is a good case to be made for optimism. I mean, between 2000 and 2014, India and China together pulled something like almost 250 million people out of poverty, 140 million of those in India. And yet, we've probably seldom had a time when we had a stronger sense of standing on the brink of losing the familiar ways, of maybe even facing extinction, and of the fragility of human life, whether it's due to climate change, nuclear weapons, whatever, and of geopolitical tensions, technological disruption as well. If you look at global battle deaths, which seem to have gone away really before 2010 or so, by 2016, we're back up to about 200,000 a year, which is peak levels for the Cold War. You look at displaced persons around the world, we're now at about, 2017, we're about 70 million, which is post-World War II figures, when the Chinese Civil War was going on and Europe was just recovering. So these are 1946-47 figures, 70 million displaced. So this is not a good situation, and this combination how have we come to this? How have we come to this paradoxical situation? A lot of it is actually a consequence of the globalization decades and of what we did during the world's unipolar moment, when the US was the sole superpower after the Cold War. And it's probably the result of the linking together of the planet's economy today by technology, by globalization, by global supply chains, by a whole host of things, trade, investment, relatively open trade and investment for decades. And that economic change of globalization has really created has spurred geopolitical changes. For one thing, it made the world one geographically. It's now one economic unit everybody knows. We live in a globalized economy. But we're also now probably one geopolitical unit. I mean, I have friends who describe it as one global battle space. There are no peripheral areas, empty areas, irrelevant areas anymore. There's a civil war in Syria, you have a refugee crisis here. But you think of it also, there is today a continuous belt of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and chemical, all the way from the Mediterranean to the Western Pacific, from Israel to North Korea, in one continuous belt, with the means to deliver them in terms of ballistic missiles all the way across. We have whole new domains for contention, cyberspace, outer space, and when North Korea fires a missile over Japan into the Pacific in 1998, Japan is now part of Asia's geopolitics. She's no longer an offshore balancer who can sit there and intervene when it suits her, you know, the traditional way the British used to describe themselves for the continent. That's no longer true. But what's happened also is that the significance of different areas for the global system has shifted tremendously. In 1950, the G7 share in world GDP on a PPP basis was 51%, and the emerging markets were 36%. By 2012, those proportions had been completely reversed. It was the other way around. And the center of gravity of the world economy is shifting eastwards. By 2008, China was the world's largest trading power, the world's largest manufacturing nation, and the world's third largest military power on earth, and was well on course to overtaking the US as the world's largest economy. In a similar period, if you look at the 3 decades from the late 80s, India rose to become the 5th largest economy in the world in nominal terms, 3rd largest in PPP terms. And the IMF now estimates that India will continue to grow at 6.8% this year, 7.2% next year, and 7.5% for the next 2 years after that. So at present rates, GDP per capita in India doubles every 12 years. And that's transformative, both for India and for Asia. By 2014, India and China together accounted for about half of Asia's total GDP. And their combined share of world GDP in 2016 of 17.6% in nominal terms, or 25.86% in PPP terms, still well below their share of population, which is 37.5%. But it is a huge economic force today, which wasn't there 25 years ago. Last year, and the sources of growth too. Last year, China accounted for 25% of the growth in the world economy. India accounted for 15%. That's where the driving force of the economy is coming from. But it's not only India and China. It's South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Iran for a while, Bangladesh, other economies too. So we now face the prospect really where 2 of the 3 largest economies in the world will be not just in Asia, but would have relatively poor populations in per capita terms, while they have the economic power and the weight, with unsatisfied aspirations and the revisionist politics that go with them. And this is not a situation that either Asia or the world is used to so far. And the result of this shift in economic weight is really the backlash that we see against globalization in the West. And for the last 5 years, both China and the US have been onshoring production. If you look at value added in exports and in the global value chains, the chains have actually shrunk, and both of them are doing much more at home. With the US pulling out of TPP, moving away from the WTO, and even when they get into their own spat, when they have a tariff war, they don't go to the WTO for solutions. They're not looking for outside. They deal with it through a bilateral negotiation. So you now have a very peculiar situation. If you think of it, the reason I think why the world seems out of joint to all of us, the world is multipolar economically. Power's moved, you look at shares of GDP, where the growth is coming from, etc. We just went through that. Militarily, it's still unipolar. You know, the Royal Navy at the height of the British Empire used to have a two-navy standard. They had to be equal, at least equal to the next two biggest navies in the world. The US Navy is equivalent to the next 16 navies put together. The US defense budget is equivalent to the next 7 biggest national defense budgets in the world. Now, if that's not unipolarity, I don't know what is. So you have a multipolar world economically. You have a militarily unipolar world. Politically, of course, we're all thoroughly confused. We have no idea of how to actually deal with this. In the past, when you've had problems like this kind of dysfunction, you've ended up dealing with it with conflict. Luckily, you now have nuclear deterrence actually imposes a cap on that. And you're hoping that interdependence, economic interdependence, will also limit the use of conflict to try and resolve this fundamental imbalance or disjuncture. But it is this systemic imbalance between the distribution of economic power, of military power, of political power in the world that really creates this sense of instability and insecurity that we seem to have. It also creates space for various groups to use, whether it's state sponsors of terrorism or whether it's for non-state actors like Daesh and so on, where they manage to find the space to actually grow. Now, for Asia, the particular problem is that today, as a result of globalization, all the Asian countries are much more dependent on the outside world than they ever were before. When we started radical reform in India in 1991, roughly about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade, just goods. By 2014, that proportion was up to 49.6%. If you added services, more than half GDP depends on the external sector. So we actually need the rest of, we haven't quite realized this ourselves, by the way. But this is true of all the Asian countries. What globalization did to these countries which grew so rapidly was to make us all much more dependent on the outside world. We have therefore today no choice but to seek to manage that external environment. To actually, when we talk of China's activism and that suddenly they're out there doing things, trying to manage the periphery, trying to establish bases in Djibouti and so on, much of this is because of this peculiar situation they find themselves in, which is totally unprecedented in their history, of actually needing the rest of the world for their own prosperity and to keep their economies going. And the leadership, therefore, has no choice but to try and manage the external environment, work with others where they can, or otherwise try for... This is why, for the first time in her history, China is trying to evolve into a maritime power. She spent 4,000 years worried about barbarians on land. And in fact, many of the dynasties who ruled China actually came out of Eurasia. But for the first time, she's comfortable enough on land in Eurasia to actually try, and she's so dependent on the maritime routes which bring her energy, which carry her exports, that she's now trying to become a maritime power. Whether she'll succeed or not is another question. But the fact is that it's one of the consequences of the way that we have developed and grown thanks to globalization that is actually helps to explain what you see today in the geopolitics. The more the West pushes Russia into Chinese arms, the easier it is for China to seek to consolidate the Eurasian landmass, whether through the Belt and Road, by building railways, roads, fiber optic cables, trading. 20 years ago, only 2 of China's neighbors had China as their biggest trading partner. Today, every one of her neighbors has China as their biggest trading partner, with 2 exceptions, Afghanistan and Bhutan. That's it. Everybody else, and it's true of India, our biggest trading partner in goods today is China. If you add services, it's the US. If you look at Europe as a whole as one, then Europe is our biggest trading partner, is India. This is happening at a time when, frankly, the Asia-Pacific, at least, is an area of revisionist powers, none of whom was entirely satisfied or even considered itself bound by the geopolitical settlements imposed after World War II and the Cold War. Not Russia, not China, not Iran, not Japan. You can see they want to revise their constitution. Not even India, because we just weren't part of all those settlements or arrangements, and so on. I mean, I can go through the whole list. So as a result, today, Asian politics have returned to national rivalries, to territorial disputes, to naval buildups, to other such historical claims. And the uncertainty has actually driven the world's largest arms race ever in history in the last 30 years in Asia. And most of it offensive weapons, submarines, ballistic missiles. If you look at what Asia has been doing, Asia Pacific especially, led by China, of course, double-digit growth in the PLA budgets every year now for almost 26 years. But also followed very close behind by other countries who have been doing so. So we now have a peculiar situation when, from India's point of view, when we look at Asia, you look east, you see very strong state structures getting almost much more totalitarian almost in their use of technology to control their own societies. The most dynamic economies in the world, and decades of very rapid growth have given them the means to actually accumulate hard power, to buy weapons, to build up, and that arms race that I mentioned. You look west from India, and it's very different. The Westphalian state is weak. In most places west of India, when you look at West Asia, the state is actually overshadowed by non-state actors. Regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, they contend for dominance and try to bring outside powers into their own struggle for mastery. And the economic growth is weak or stagnant in what are basically rentier economies. And fundamental issues of legitimacy, the role of religion, and its relationship to the state are still being worked out. What's also happened recently is that, frankly, when we look at it, Western interest in stability in West Asia has declined now that the US is self-sufficient in oil and gas, and frankly, OPEC, especially West Asian OPEC members, account for a much smaller proportion of energy supplies for the West. The West can do without, is not going to make the kinds of investments in stability in the region that countries like China, India, Japan, Korea would make. And it seems to me that it is today really the Asian powers who have an interest in the security of the sea lanes that carry that energy out of West Asia. And one of the reasons why it's possible for the US to switch policy on Iran, to say we won't deal with anybody who buys oil from Iran and so on, is frankly because they don't have a dog in the fight. So they can actually deal with it ideologically. For the Indian subcontinent, we are linked to both these very different pictures that I told you that we see when we look west and east. And yet, despite the apparent differences, both West and East Asia are actually increasingly linked by not just Asia-Pacific's dependence on West Asia's oil and gas, but if you look at extremism and terrorism, for instance, you saw what happened in Sri Lanka recently. But where has ISIS expanded in the recent past, apart from trying to create Khorasan in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India? But it's also, you've seen incidents in Jakarta in the last 3 years. You've seen in the southern Philippines, where they've actually taken over whole groups. Abu Sayyaf, they just swallowed it, which seems to be the ISIS means to find a local group and then, rather than actually building them up from zero. You've seen southern Thailand. And what we've seen, therefore, is because of rapid social change, because of globalization, we've seen the radicalization not just of political Islam, but of political Buddhism, political Hinduism, of religion generally throughout the region, in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, in Myanmar, in Thailand. And all these have a common sense of victimhood, which in significant proportions of each of these countries' populations, which is something that used to be, we were used to that in West Asia, but we're now seeing it actually through the rest of Asia. The other thing that globalization did, of course, was to threaten identity in both advanced and emerging societies. And the result was the rise of a whole new, I suppose, authoritarian form of politics, with an attack on reason, on logic, on liberalism, and the rise of increasingly of chauvinism and nationalism right across Eurasia. We've seen the coming to power of new authoritarians, first in Asia, actually, from 2012 onwards. Whether you look at Japan, you look at China, you look at India, going west. I mean, Trump is only the last of this phenomenon. And now, frankly, why it happened within societies and so on is a big issue. My problem is, I think, because of the rapid pace of change and urbanization, especially in societies like India and China, you've pulled people out of their traditional village, clan, support structures into urban anonymity, where they are now exposed, thanks to social media, other things, to a whole range of aspirations and ideas and ideologies, good or bad, I mean, all of this. And they've, in a sense, lost their social moorings within these societies. And therefore, this is not something that's going to go away tomorrow. This form of politics based on emotion, based on mob psychology, rather than on traditional appeals to either political interest or reason. But the problem from a geopolitical point of view is that this kind of politics, ultranationalist politics, reduces the ability to compromise, to give and take, to bargain, the stuff that diplomats do every day. And the way in which you can deal with the kinds of territorial other disputes that are now cropping up throughout Asia. And if you look at the entire range of new security issues, they all require cooperative solutions. None of them are things that one country can deal with on its own. Look at climate change, look at cyber security, look at outer space, where you now see increasing militarization. You look at the use of commons. I mean, the contention about the use of maritime spaces now, which used to be regarded as global commons. All these require cooperative solutions. And yet, domestic politics throughout Asia today make that much more difficult. So I think what you therefore have now is a situation where domestic politics, it's almost the perfect storm if you look at it. You have domestic politics, you have this disjuncture between economics and political power and the distribution of it. You have revisionist powers with real power. I mean, for the first time. I mean, that's not a situation that the world is used to. So where do we go from here? I mean, is it really so bad that we're heading for disaster? I told you why I don't think this is a recipe for immediate conflict between the great powers. As I said, because of nuclear deterrence, also interdependence makes a difference. Nobody's suicidal in this. But the other reason for me of hope is because China's rise is not a traditional power transition from one hegemon to the other. You know, we all argue by analogy. And I mean, there are some tropes that everybody's absorbed, at least. World War I, how that came about. Munich, we have these Vietnam War, we have a whole series of arguments by analogy. And now we talk of the Thucydides trap, or you have books which say, when China rules the world. But that ignores not only Chinese strategic culture, but also the very different situation in which China is. That sort of assumes that China is going to behave like the US did when she had the power. This is, to my mind, this isn't the new myth. The old myth used to be when China uses the market and develops, she'll become like everybody else in the world, which was a myth. It never happened, and it's never going to happen. But now we believe, oh, she's going to behave, but she's not. That's not what either her situation or her strategic culture would lead her to. She doesn't have the geographic luxury of sitting behind two of the world's largest oceans and intervening when it suits her. She's in a crowded neighborhood surrounded by rising or established powers, by Japan, Russia, India, Korea, wherever. And that's not an easy situation. She's hemmed in by the first island chain, which is all the way from Japan down through Taiwan, Ryukyu's Taiwan, all the way to the Philippines, which is entirely in the hands of the US allies or the US. She has the world's greatest armada sitting 12 nautical miles off the coast, literally in her face. And she can't get a submarine out of there without everybody in the world knowing where it's going. And okay, it was built for the Soviets, but the Soviets are long gone and the system still works. So her demography is against her. By 2040, China will have the same age structure as Japan has today, which is the oldest, the most gray of all the advanced societies on Earth today. With her dependence on the outside world, she's trying to become a maritime power, as I said. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, to know how to deal with a completely different kind of domain. And nor does she have any experience. There's never been a Pax Sinica, and it's never been tried even. I mean, the Chinese, if you look at Chinese strategic culture, all the way Han Feizi, all of them, they have a fairly unitary view of the world, but people in relation to their culture, they're not trying to convert the world to be Chinese. And that's never been, they're not a city on the hill the way the US sees herself. It's very hard to find any example of that. Maybe they've been westernized now to the point, or Americanized now to the point of thinking so, but I haven't seen any serious Chinese strategic thinkers with ideas like that about how they're going to. For the first time, you had Xi Jinping saying at the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, that China is ready to take center stage, and that the Chinese model can be an example for other people. The last time you heard this one was when Mao Zedong was exporting revolution in the 60s. That's so maybe, but so far they haven't proposed an alternate order. They're very happy with the existing order. They just want to tweak it to work for themselves. So it's not as though they are offering an alternative or saying we want to get rid of this. They just want this order to work for them, which frankly is a legitimate expectation by most countries. The problem, of course, is that on top of this uncertainty about China, you have uncertainty about the world's most powerful country, about US behavior. So you're talking about uncertainty about the two biggest powers on Earth and how they're going to work. This is not a cheerful prospect. In October 2018, Vice President Pence made a speech which change decades of US policy of trying to integrate China into the Western order and basically redefine China as a strategic competitor. And since then, you've seen the US has imposed tariffs, has also made a series of demands on China, which in effect would change Chinese industrial policy, technology policy, and from a Chinese point of view would be a cap on China's rise, would actually limit her ability to become the kind of country that she wants to. So it's very hard to see how China can accommodate these parts of US demands. These are very much like what the US demanded of Japan in the 80s, remember, before the Plaza Accords. And the Chinese have told the Americans that we're not Japan, we're not your subordinate ally, and we're not going to sign a Plaza Accord. Look what it did to Japan. They've had 20 years of stagnation as a result. What they can do is accommodate the Americans on the trade deficit, which somehow for this US administration seems to matter a great deal. They can buy much more from the US and do something about the deficit, and everyone can declare victory and go home happily. But that doesn't solve the basic problem, because US policy since World War II has been to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor in the world. And it's hard to change your mind on something so fundamental. They've seen off several potential competitors. They saw off the Soviet Union, they saw off Japan, which they thought was a real competitor for a while. You remember the same kind of books, When Japan Rules the World, identical titles. Now China. So it seems to me that neither side can actually give way on this, on the fundamentals. They will have agreements, but they'll be agreements like Trump's agreement with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. Everybody can go home happy, tension's gone, but the fundamental dynamic of the relationship has not been changed in any real way. I mean, Kim Jong-un has his weapons, is not going to give them away. So we therefore have the prospect of the two most powerful countries on earth actually having much more contentious relations. So where does that leave everybody else in Asia? Nobody wants to have to choose between China and the US. I mean, for all of us, the rest of us, Japan, India, all of us, both are important. But the immediate reaction to the shift in the balance of power, to China's rise, for Japan, for instance, was to tighten the security arrangements with the US. And so did others. And for other countries in Asia to start doing much more among themselves because of uncertainty of what either their ally, the US, was doing or what China was doing. And if you look at Japan, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, today the kinds of defense, security, intelligence cooperation that we do was unthinkable 15 years ago, because we had much more faith in the order, frankly. So where do I think this will end up? There's three possible futures if you look at the order in Asia. One, of course, is an order centered on a single power. US traditionally, now China is a possible potential. But I don't think that really works, because there is, not only does China not have the power to impose an order centered on herself in this crowded environment where other countries are rising as well, but also it doesn't really address the real problems that we see around us, whether it's, as I said, maritime security, whether it's cyber security, whether it is the military build-up that's been going on. The second is some form of multipolar order, which with collective security may be based even on a G2 between the US and China. I mean, if they conceivably, even though it seems unlikely, manage to come together. But that won't again solve you think that's going to solve the South China Sea? They both agree on denuclearizing North Korea, by the way. That's been their declared goal for a long time. But that's not going to happen. He's seen what happened to Gaddafi, who gave up his weapons. He's seen what happened to Saddam, who acted as if he had weapons when he didn't. He's not going to give up. This is what has brought him to top table, got him a meeting with Trump, created space for him to function on the international stage. He's got Putin now. He's just had a summit with Putin. So even if China and the US agree on certain things, on the goal, on what they want to achieve, that doesn't mean that that's going to work with the way power is distributed today in Asia. That's the problem with this kind of dysfunctional distribution of power. So then what are we left with? Probably with what you in Europe are most familiar with, at least in the second half of the 19th century. Several powers of different capabilities and different levels of power, all contending among each other, with each other, building alliances where it suits them. A very unstable sort of contention among themselves. Now it's not going to be, therefore, for me at least, this is not a multipolar world. And I think we use the word too frequently and too easily. I don't think it's a very orderly world. It's maybe you'll have to build, each of us will have to build coalitions, issue-based coalitions of the willing. On maritime security, you'd pick one lot of countries. As I said, the countries who have a common interest in keeping sea lanes open through the Indo-Pacific are really Japan, China, India, Australia, those who depend on those sea lanes. And it makes sense for them to work together. On cybersecurity, you'd need a whole different set of countries. So you do issue-based coalitions of the willing, depending on what you're actually trying to deal with. But it's a messy business, and it means it's a lot of work. And it means a kind of diplomacy which our domestic politics makes so difficult at the same time. So please don't ask me to predict where we're going. I will end where we started, with uncertainty. But I'm not very, very pessimistic about how it actually turns out. But the real problem here is that, just like for Europe, between Westphalia and the end of the Second World War, the period of Asia's greatest economic success is also the period of the most political uncertainty and conflict. Thank you.
I do believe we are fulfilling the major criteria in Harvard for good seminar, which means you end up confused on a higher level. But from this point of view, I have 2 or 3 questions, and then basically I'll go to the audience. But one is very much about China and China's strategic culture. I very much agree with you. I was always trying to imagine what is the difference in which United States and China know the world. America knows the world to the extent that people from all over the world goes to the United States and they're becoming Americans. In a certain way, America knows the world by transforming others to become Americans. So the melting pot is the instrument through which America knows the world. China knows the world through the Chinatown. You have a place which is very closed in itself. It's not trying to change the environment, but very much to exploit it. But not also allowing the environment to change it at all, basically. I'm saying this because I was very much intrigued, but this is changing. During the Mao period, in fact, in the 1960s, China was a bigger exporter of revolution than the Soviet Union. And we talk about analogies. People now talk about the Cold War. To what extent our own discourses on China can turn China into a kind of a model exporting culture, nevertheless that probably their traditional model is not. This is my first question to you.
Well, it seems to me that I think history is only part of the explanation of their strategic culture today, because it has, after all, Marxism itself was not, it wasn't a Chinese construct. It was imported and indigenized in a sense. They did that to Buddhism also, by the way, earlier. But if you look at Chinese strategic culture traditionally, all of them, if you Sun Tzu, Han Feizi, all of them, essentially the world was a universe. There was heaven, there was son of heaven, there was everybody else in relation to this. The more you spoke Chinese, the more acculturated you were, the less of a barbarian you were. But you owed respect to authority in this universe. And I say this because for an Indian, you read Kautilya, for instance, Chanakya, the world is a multiverse. The world is, he writes about a kingdom, But your neighbors could be a republic, could be a confederation, could be a city-state. Your neighbor's neighbor is your friend, because your neighbor, he assumes, will be your enemy. You'll have disputes with him. This is exactly the world we live in today. But that's a very different conception of how the world is ordered and structured. There's no mandate of heaven here. So it's fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. And that doesn't mean, therefore, in the traditional Chinese worldview, you don't therefore export you don't actually, in fact, it's for other people to come and choose to be civilized, rather than you're trying to export the model. Now, that's why I said a lot depends on how far Chinese strategic culture has been westernized. Because the whole idea of proselytization was a very new idea throughout Asia, and came into it really since Buddhism, second time only in the 19th century. And the idea that you would export ideology. Today what China is exporting is threefold. When Xi Jinping talks of a model, the Belt and Road offers economic connectivity and projects and money and financing and ties to China, physical ties to China. But he's also offering, and you see this in Zimbabwe, you see it in various places in Africa, a total solution to a country's security problems. Saying we have the technology which helps you to know what your people are thinking, doing. And they are actually exporting that technology, cyber, telephones, everything. And in China itself, they're doing a social credit system, which assumes 100% knowledge of what people do. That if you spit on the streets, you'll lose 1 social credit. And if you join the party, you'll gain 30 credits, and so on. But that assumes that you know exactly who's doing what all the time. And the third part of it, there is also an understanding that we will not interfere in your internal affairs, and we will actually ring fence you from everybody else. That's very attractive, taken together. That's much more attractive than the liberal international order, which tells you about how you should manage human rights, how you should manage your own affairs, how you should deal with the rest of the world. But it hasn't developed yet into an alternate model that's ready to export. And so I'm not sure where they'll go. And ultimately, these things get exported, ideologies, whatever, when you have the capacity, when you have the power. Today, China's power in military and enforcement terms is still primarily regional. So, and the resistance in the region is pretty strong. I mean, you can't say that China has tremendous soft power in her own region. In fact, probably the least of all the great powers. So, she has the economic power today to actually reach across the world and to actually try the Belt and Road and globalization with Chinese characteristics. But the answer, therefore, I'm not so sure that this is about to happen, that suddenly the world is going to become like China.
No, I'm very much in agreement with you.
Or that they will actually push it. You see, Mao Zedong and 60s, yes, they were much more aggressive, but that came from a fundamentally European ideology which was universalist. I mean, there was, proletarian internationalism had its roots, and Mao, I think, used that.
I totally agree, but here's the story. Europeans believe that what you're exporting is institutions. And now the Chinese believe that what you export is technology, because it's a totally different idea of governance.
Right.
In Ecuador, basically as a result of the surveillance technology that exported by China, crime was reduced 30%. And imagine some of the Latin American countries which has a very high crime levels. And you come and this says, listen, it's not about the nature of the regime. I'm asking this because in the beginning of the century, in the United States, there was a very strong idea that China can be contained basically first because its neighbors mistrust it, but also developing a very strong idea that the political nature of the regime is critical, and from this point of view, India was the preferable ally. And if you're going to see if there is anything that is totally continuous in the American foreign policy, starting with George W. Bush, this is a focus on India. George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump. This is the natural ally. And from this point of view, I'm going to push you very much on this side, because in a certain way, it's not simply how India sees the world, but how others sees India. And India, from this point of view, is a strange state. I have been twice, but I have the advantage. This is the institution in which India is much more present, having an Indian rector. And one of the stories is that I do believe that there are going to be huge demands on India. The more China becomes bigger, the more people are going to push India to believe that India should do what others expect from India.
Well, it's true. I mean, I think there's, and we have a big discussion at home, you know, what India's role and so on. US, I think the first time was Condoleezza Rice in 2000 in her article before George W. Bush was elected, and she laid out his foreign policy, and she said, the rise of India is in the US strategic interest, which was very different from saying some tactical alliance against keep the communists out or do this or do that. And I think since then, that's been fairly consistent US policy. This administration a little more transactional, but there are still large parts of the US and important parts like the Pentagon and so on in Congress which support that basic idea. So when Vajpayee, Prime Minister Vajpayee started talking of India-US as natural allies and so on, it was reciprocal. It worked on both sides, and it has borne fruit for both of us, I think. But what role India should play, you know, of course, there are people in India who think, you know, we should go out there and cut a grand figure, and I'm not one of those. I actually think that the job of Indian foreign and security policy is to enable the transformation of India into, now you might say this is a very selfish of you, yes, but ultimately India has too many poor people, too many malnourished, too many sick. I mean, we have big jobs at home. We might have achieved wonderful things and remarkable things we've never achieved before in history, but it's not enough. We still have a long way to go. So the job of our foreign and security policies is to create an enabling environment for that transformation of India into a modern, prosperous, strong country where every Indian can achieve his potential. Now that's, for me, the function. So when people say you should be responsible power, you should do this, do that, I tend to be a little suspicious. Normally their definition of responsible is whatever suits them. If it suits me, I'll do it. Fine, I don't see why I shouldn't do it, if it's in my interest. I mean, as I said, the security of the sea lanes which bring our oil, gas, etc., which also bring other people's oil and gas, it makes sense for us to do that. But I'm not going to accept some general role. We've spent a long time fighting for our independence, and ever since then, we've tried to be either non-aligned or basically to maintain our strategic autonomy. And I don't see India giving that up very easily. And the more confused the situation gets, the more the demands for India to be responsible, to play her due role. And you know, it's very easy to flatter our ego and say, you're a big country, you must do big things for the world. And many Indians actually get taken in by that. But I'm a bit cynical. Maybe I'm getting too old.
No, you're not cynical. Comes my last question, which is also kind of, for me, as European coming from a very small country, kind of a surprise. I was in India twice in my life, and it was an eye-opening experience. And one, I was asked to give a talk on the European Union. Bangalore, I was talking something, saying how unique we are, overlapping legislation. We had democracy, but we don't have a demos and so on. And there was 9 persons very patiently listening to me. And then was one who said, it's very nice, what you're describing is the post-colonial Indian state. Don't have a common language, overlapping legislations, this and that. But there is one major difference. And in India, the idea as a state actor of a state sovereignty is very strong. In a certain way, you're one of the most sovereignist of anybody. Basically, everybody says that they prefer to negotiate with the Chinese than with Indians. This is true. On the other side, basically, the European idea of these overlapping and complex structures push us to believe that we are post-sovereignist. I'm trying now very also egoistically to see how you're building a very strong self-sovereignty with this type of a very difficult structure in which you are not basically, it's a big space, It's very different states. People are not, common public space in my view is slightly a metaphor. Because when you see this talk about sovereign Europe, are you buying or not? But if it works, it should be something like India. You have succeeded this. Was it an elite construct only? To what extent people are buying it? To what extent also this relates to the idea of the military power or not? But this is a questions which I want to ask you before we go to other people, much more interesting questions.
You know, it's a very interesting question, because if you look at South Asia, I mean, the subcontinent as a whole, these might be old nations, but they're all brand new states. I mean, less than 1/3 of what is India today was actually ruled directly by the British. So it's not as though these are new state structures. So a lot of the time has been spent in establishing state structures and state formation, as it were, in a situation where, at least in India, it's unique. It's not based on ethnicity, it's not based on language, it's not based on common religion, it's not based on any of the criteria that were used to build nationalism in the 19th century, and which are exactly what lead us into wars and trouble if you look around the world today. So you have this plural society which is building a state in a situation where everybody in that country is a minority one way or the other. When you cut it by region, by language, by religion, by whatever, caste and so on. So you have no choice but to build a loose federal structure which has to be democratic, because how else does everybody feel he has a chance to influence policy? Except by doing the politics of democracy, which is building alliances and working with other people who share his interests. Her, I mean, that's so it's an interesting experiment. It's not, and I don't think it can be judged just by other. It's not only elite, because it wouldn't have lasted so long. After all, for the first 2 decades, people kept saying, you know, this country is going to break up. How can it go on like this? This is impossible. But it's not just held together. Today, there's no existential threat to the unity of India. Nothing that actually could threaten it. So it's obviously worked because of this strange combination of a very hard external carapace of sovereignty, but a relatively loose construct internally, where you're willing to negotiate with local sentiment, create special arrangements within the Constitution. And we've had a whole series of amendments within the Constitution which leave space for people to follow what they see as their interests within this federal structure, which, by the way, is a word that's never even used in the Constitution anywhere. Nowhere does it say federation, but in practice that's what it is. So it's an interesting experiment. But unlike Xi Jinping, I don't think there's an Indian model that we can export, because I don't think there are other people who, you know, it's very hard to think of another country like India with the same interests, same level of development, same, you know, I don't think so. Some Indians are tempted. We like to say we know what we're doing and to preach, but frankly, I don't think we'll ever get there. What's happening now, though, is, as I said, because of our now this new dependence on the rest of the world, and with not just economic, but in every which way, in terms of security and so on. I mean, the borders, that external borders of sovereignty are actually becoming more porous. If you look at our role on climate change negotiation, it's evolved tremendously in 10 years. We're now willing to actually, you know, think trans-border and to work with other people and to assume commitments to the international society that 10 years ago we wouldn't. And I think that's going to increase as we get more dependent, more interdependent, more tied into the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. We are going to your questions. Now I understand also one of the major difference between India and Europe. You said that in India, everybody is a minority. In Europe, everybody is a former majority. And this is different. But saying this, listen, Phil, I do believe it's a great opportunity and we have a possibility for normal conversation. So please, questions. It could be also not simply questions, remarks, agreement, disagreement, please.
My name is Krzysztof Zalewski, and I'm from the Warsaw-based think tank, the Brookings Institute. My question is, where to start. Here, you are very critical about the state of the research of international relations in India, and you have called it multiple times. Are you also so critical about Indian foreign policy as it is right now executed? And if it's not optimal in the neighborhood, what could you do better, thinking about Pakistan and recent terrorist strikes, thinking about a kind of instability in Sri Lanka, thinking about Maldives, thinking about, look at every country in the neighborhood, and it has some problems India try to basically address, but with, let's say, mixed results. Yeah. So if you could comment on that.
Well, on the first part about IR in India, this is the trouble with the internet. Every word you say comes back to bite you. I was speaking at a conference of Indian IR scholars, which we do every year. And I was asked, what should we do to develop IR studies in India? And I said what I thought was wrong with it, which is that we swallow wholesale theory and ideas from abroad. We don't develop IR applied to the particular case of India. That we need to actually think about India's own particular cases and then develop it. The theory has to follow from our practices, not the other way around. If you look at how the English school developed and when it started becoming effective, or any of them, you read, US, most of the US, whether it was realists or whatever. And I think that was my fundamental argument, and that's where, so yes, I'm critical of IR studies in India today, but I also said that there's a whole new generation of young IR scholars in India who are actually much better than their forebearers and who are actually doing very good work on IR in India. And this is the globalized generation of scholars who work in India, work abroad, come back. For them, these borders don't exist in their minds. Am I as critical of foreign policy? Please read my next book in the fall. Yes, I am critical, I think, now of bits and pieces. I think I'm critical even of what we did when I was in government. I think in choices. I think we try to be objective, but it's very hard to be objective about yourself, right? There is a problem there. But I think, for me, there is a basic continuity to Indian foreign policy, which it doesn't matter who, maybe the expression of it changes. Every democratic government wants to say, we are new, we're better, nobody else knew anything before us, and nobody after us will, but we know. This is part of politics. But the fact is that basically we've been doing the same thing. As I said, based on strategic autonomy, on trying to integrate the neighborhood. Why did Sri Lanka survive 26 years of civil war with 1 year of negative growth? Why did Nepal survive 12 years of civil war with 1 year of negative growth? Because we've actually integrated the economies. And the Indian economy was doing well and pulled us all along. And so, I think if you think of it in the slightly longer term, not in the day-to-day calculus of, are we winning today, are we winning tomorrow? No, but if you look at the slightly longer term, I think we have achieved some of our interests in the neighborhood, of trying to integrate it, but never forget, part of the problem is India is big, whether we like it or not. We're so much bigger than each of our smaller neighbors, and they're all connected with each other through us. And these are also new states, whether it's Nepal, whether it's the only ones which wasn't is actually Sri Lanka. Bangladesh, brand new state. So how do you develop a new state? How do you build nationalism in a new state? The obvious target is the big neighbor next door. And so there is a certain dynamic which I am amazed has not got worse, actually. The logic of the situation should have been much worse. Also because these borders are artificial. There isn't a single border in the subcontinent which doesn't have the same ethnicity on both sides, doesn't have the same language on both sides, people don't eat the same food. Where? These lines actually mean almost nothing. in the kind of affinities you see across. They marry across, they live across, every one of these borders, whether it's India, Bangladesh, whether it's the Myanmar border, where the people we call Mizos are Chin on their side. So we need to learn to live with that and to find a way of managing that without threatening their sense of identity. Without actually, and that's not an easy process to develop over time. And I think we haven't done a bad job of it. So far, if you take it over the last 72 years, I think it's really not such a bad job. But yes, I think day to day there are lots of things we do wrong. And there's lots of things they do wrong too. But that's okay. That I can live with. As long as we're heading in the right direction, which for me is a much more integrated ultimate goal, to function together as one geopolitical unit. That would be wonderful. But of course, partition made sure that that wouldn't happen. It cut our access from Central Asia and West Asia, our physical access. And when the Royal Navy left, we lost the security of the maritime domain. So it's taken years to actually overcome. China came into Tibet in 1950, within 4 years of our independence. And for the first time in history, we had a border with China. Before that, we had a border with Tibet. And now we had a border with Chinese troops on it. So, these are not easy issues to resolve overnight in a completely new geopolitical situation for India. But I think as long as we're heading in this direction of integrating the subcontinent, trying to work together, trying to deal with the facts of all these affinities, I think that's really the way forward. And I think that's something that, it can be done, but it won't be easy. It'll never be easy.
Thank you very much. Please.
My name is Thomas Winger. I just noticed that there was one country that you didn't really mention in your talk, which is a nuclear-armed neighbor. So my question is, can you comment on how you see the possibility there of Secret Service and the military at some point?
You're talking about China, right?
Yes, I'm talking about the other one. The military relinquishing power to a democratically elected government, and if they do, the risk of a fundamental Islamic State being established there.
I think the first is most unlikely, that the military will ever actually give up its hold on power. They didn't fight so long, and this is a country which, when the military lost more than half the country in a war, within 6 years they were back in power. So, it's structural to the nature of the distribution of power within Pakistan. By the 70s already, they'd eliminated mass-based parties. They'd eliminated the left. The military had started working with religion in order to prevent the emergence of liberal, when Bhutto tried to create a mass-based party in the PPP, they made sure that, they gutted it basically politically and created the MDMA and other religious groups to take care of it. So I think it's very unlikely, based on past experience and the present role of the military and the role they see for themselves as guardians of Pakistan and its ideology, that they will actually hand over real power to anybody else, whether civilian politicians or anyone else. So far, at least, it's not in their interest to see an Islamic state. I mean, it is Islamic by definition already under Nizam-e-Mustafa's and Zia's time, but it's unlikely that they will actually allow that to go beyond a stage, because then it starts affecting their own institutional interest, and I don't see that happening. Why didn't I mention Pakistan? Because honestly, I think it's a strategic distraction. Tactically, it's a daily nuisance. I mean, yes, you have to deal with it, with cross-border terrorism, with all that. But, how much does it contribute to the well-being of the Indian people if you dealt with those issues successfully? Not very much. I mean, so that's part of the problem. Pakistan has tremendous nuisance value, but there isn't that much that she's going to do for you even if you settle everything tomorrow. there is a problem there. I mean, and certainly it's not contributing to Asian geopolitics in any large way.
Thank you very much. Questions? Comments? Yeah, please. Eva.
Thank you. Eva Atanasov, a fellow here. Well, I have two questions. They're more theoretical, partly because I don't know the region enough to be asking more concrete, practical questions. But you mentioned that the purpose of Indian foreign policy should be to create an enabling environment for India's own development and integration, and not try to cut a great figure in the world. And I'm wondering, what do you mean by an enabling environment, and whether you could imagine a situation in which cutting a great figure might be part of that plan, right? Being trying to play the part of a great power, balancing China and all that, perhaps even contributing to the nation building of the small states around India, whether that could be something that you could imagine in the future of the region. And the second, more theoretical question, you mentioned that we seem to be backward, at least in Asia, I think probably globally, to a 19th century situation with multiple actors, issue-based alliances, and a very complicated diplomacy deficit. And I'm wondering to what extent that's new or that's old, or is that the nature of the world, that we're somehow back to a natural foreign policy environment after the perhaps anomalous 20th century, or maybe that's a prelude to a future. You also talk about growing interdependence and perhaps something changing in foreign policy altogether with globalization proceeding apace. Thank you.
Huge questions. What do I mean by an enabling environment? If you look at India, there's 3 or 4 things that strike you from the basic drivers of policy. Geography, history, demography, the things that don't change. I mean, you look at India's resource endowment. We've always, in history, been people rich, resource poor. No non-ferrous metals, for instance, energy. And in history, we've been one of the world's largest, markets for military manpower. It's part of the way where India is and how society has been structured. It's part of, or you look at the geography of it. I mean, India's done best when she's most connected to the rest of the world. And most of that has been along maritime South Asia until the Great Divergence. You look at the most advanced parts of India, which were equivalent to the most advanced parts of, say, North Europe, or to Zhejiang and Hangzhou and the eastern seaboard in China, and which accounted, along with China, for 2/3 of world's industrial production. It was really Gujarat, the Malabar coast, the Coromandel coast, Vanga, which is sort of Orissa, Bengal, and the Andhra coast. These are the bits that were most connected to the world and were as advanced as any other part of the world and did best, which is, so there's a certain internal logic to working with the rest of the world and making sure that world helps you to transform India. We tried autarkic development for a while in the 50s, 60s, and ended up with what we used to call the Hindu rate of growth, 3.5%, which, by the way, is more than Britain ever achieved in the Industrial Revolution. But we are never satisfied with that, right? Because it wasn't enough. I mean, population was growing much faster and so on. So that's when I say an enabling environment, you need to look to the rest of the world to fill in the blanks, the gaps, and to create a situation where you can actually. And the first thing in that is a peaceful periphery. You need to get on with your neighbors. You can't get entangled in other people's quarrels. You can't become part of an alliance and because somebody else has trouble, then you start spending your effort there. You have enough to do at home, and that's why I say an enabling. But yes, if cutting a figure helps you to do this, to actually transform India, do it. But I haven't seen a good argument yet to maybe there will be a stage in the future where you do have to do much more outside, take on bigger responsibilities. Maybe. I mean, it's conceivable. I wouldn't say no. About the 19th century situation, and is it new? It's certainly new for Asia. If you think of the geopolitics of Asia, we've gone through sort of three phases, the bipolar Cold War. In Asia, that ended much earlier than it did in Europe because of the Sino-Soviet split and because of what Japan did to economically integrate Asia through the 80s and 90s. A lot of these global supply chains and so on were actually Japan's doing first. And you could see how development grew. And then you had the post-Cold War neoliberal period when there was where the rise of China, the rise of India in an open global trading and investment environment. And that came to an end with the crisis in 2008. So it wasn't what I'm now describing as late 19th century sort of European style situation. Because these were much more structured orders where it was quite clear. And the balance of power, whether it was economic, military, political, was quite clear also, the ranking, the hierarchy, and these were all in the same places. I mean, it was the same countries which made the big calls. And so that's why I think today you're in a slightly different situation. So yes, it is a new situation. It's not the old. But all analogies must be taken with caution. When I say 19th century, it doesn't mean we're going to end up doing exactly what everyone did in the 19th century. I'm just saying that here's the kind of distribution of power that I think we are witnessing today, and the kind of state behavior that I think we can expect.
Yeah, the last question, please.
Hello, my name is Rüdiger Wischen, but I did some practical work with regard to the Chinese publishing industry. I would love to learn a little bit more about what you make of the exports now of security technology from China around the world. As you mentioned, for many of those not always very democratic countries, it's so much more convenient to work with China to get technology to maintain their elite's power on the one hand, and that comes with cash and finance support at the same time. At the same time, I very much agree with your basic assumption. China is not a centralizing power like Western Europe or the British as a colonial power had been. So I don't see, I would not expect China to build an imperium worldwide based on that centralizing potential of the security technology and finances. So what do you make of this?
No, you're quite right. You've actually summarized what I think better than I did. Because if you look at it, think of it, is China going to be Globocop? No. Will China open up her markets to everybody else the way the US did? Is China going to run the global financial system? Whether Bretton Woods, Bretton Woods, or whether it's, post 1970, 71. No. And she's showing no signs of wanting to either. So I don't see her behaving like the US or the UK did before. I don't see that at all. Whether you call it imperial or, I think centralizing is a good word, what you use. That she's not a centralizing power who decides how the world is going to look and how the world should run itself. In fact, it's the opposite. She tells people, you run your life yourself. We will not interfere in your own affairs. And what she does, therefore, is to build an order from the bottom up. The export of security technologies is one part of it, but building a bridge, building a road, building a railway, fiber optic cables, whatever, submarine cables. All these are ways of connecting people, building connectivity from the bottom up without offering some overarching architecture which actually brings it all into place. And I think that's why it is attractive to states which feel fragile or leaderships that feel threatened by their own people. I think it makes it more attractive. But yeah, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. It's not inconceivable that some stage down the road, she could decide to do all these things. I mean, that could happen, but I don't think the time is now. You know, if you think of the basics, she can't do a Monroe Doctrine in the South China Sea. Because that requires something like 70% of the naval power, which is what the US had and Japan had for 2.5 years in the same waters. She needs control of at least the littoral of these, and these are enclosed bodies of water, so theoretically it might be possible. But that's not what she's trying. And she hasn't done it yet. Until she accumulates enough power, then perhaps she'll do it. But that's some way down the road. And so that's why I think the point about the disjuncture in power between economic power and military power, political power, I think it's important to remember that. And that's one reason why I think she behaves differently.
Thank you very much. And for me, this is also a great example of the fact to what extent the analysis of the geopolitics comes from understanding of strategic cultures. If there was a realist here, he's going to say capacity defines intentions. The stronger you become, the more things basically you want to do. But I'm very grateful for this conversation, and I do believe that really having this different perspective is quite important, because one of the problems of Europe is that for a certain point of view, we really believed that we were the laboratory of the world to come. So we start to be interested in the world to the extent that the world is doing things that we expected them to do. And then people start doing things that we don't understand, and then basically we're going home. And from this point of view, having this conversation for me really is kind of important for Europe's strategic culture, if one is going to emerge. Also, I'm particularly proud that in an institution which is run by a prominent Indian scholar, it was me and not her who brought on India to speak. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ida. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks.